I can't tell you how having a daughter, I said, I can't tell you how having a daughter changed my view of the whole world.
Whoops.
We're going to pretty much make this up as we go along. That's kind of our operate in life. So we're going to have a conversation, we're going to have a chat, and it is a pretty important one, but I'm not big on formality because I don't think you have genuine conversations when they're too structured. So I'm a little different that way. We'll chat, we'll have a conversation. And I'd love to involve you. I'd love to have you ask questions as well. Otherwise, it starts to feel like you're watching television, and I don't want that to be the case. So is everybody mic'd up here? Sound desk, are we good? Everyone's got a... All right, so I guess what we'll do, I'll give everybody an opportunity to say some opening remarks. Some of you might have a bit more to say than others. Sugen, you're the only one with a presentation. Everyone else kind of, or do you have presentations? No, all right.
However you want to do it. I think they should turn me off. Are we all supposed to be on?
I think they've got faders that they can ride. So when we do start proper, they'll switch you off. And then you can whisper whatever you need to whisper. Okay. No, but you can.
I'll just talk to a few of them.
You can do it. They've got your slides and everything, haven't they? Yeah. No, honestly, we do whatever we want to do here. As long as it helps you tell your story. And we'll give you an hour. Yes, is that a raised hand for a question? Oh, no, okay. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. I think we can start. This session is about the NIP itself, 2050. So if this is not the one that you were wanting to be in, you've probably been on leave now. But otherwise, this is the hottest room in the building at the moment. So, and that's what we're going to look at, because at the end of the day, this whole story is about the plan and what the plan will do for us. I think we all pretty much agree about the importance of infrastructure development as a contributor to economic development, job creation, all of those things that we heard this morning with the Minister and the President speak about in particular. And I'm reminded by something that economist Peter Perkins said, that economic infrastructure may be compared to the foundation of a building. It plays a supporting role, facilitating the multitude of productive economic activities that constitute the bulk of the economy, or gross domestic product, links between economic infrastructure and economic growth. So I guess this is the place to start, isn't it? having a sound foundation, and this is what the NIP 2050 hopes to ensure, that the foundations for achieving the National Development Plan for inclusive growth are supported. And so we're going to try and unpack the plan. It has been open for, it's been gazetted 10 August, and it's been open for public comment. And we'll find out from Minister if people have been responding, kinds of things that have been coming through. And then we'll see if the plan can work. South Africa has never had a problem planning. I think since 1994, plans is what we do. But the challenge has been, what do we do next? How do we make those plans come to life? And so we'll explore that. We'll ask government through Minister Patricia de Lille, and also maybe even offer some advice from your own experiences, from your own areas of expertise. And so that when we come out of this room, that what I'd like is the plan to, how can it have life? It's a living document, but how can it have life? So that Minister can go back to her office and say, you know what, that was great. I learned something, and this is what we're going to do. Okay, so I think let's start by hearing from our panelists. Let me introduce them to you in no particular order, because I recognize some of them. So the Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure, Minister Patricia de Lille, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to you. Dr. Miriam Altman, Director of Altman Advisory, also a co-author of the NIP 2050. Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome. Professor Tandeka Nkiwane, Advisor to the CEO, International Affairs, NEPAD. Okay. Mr. Sugen Pillay, President, Consulting Engineer, South Africa. Ms. Marie-Francoise Marie-Nelly, World Bank Country Director, Southern Africa. And also we've got in the UK, Nick Smallwood, who's the CEO, Infrastructure and Projects Authority. Nick, thanks very much for joining us. Welcome to the chat.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Great. How's England today?
It's too cold for my liking. I prefer the weather in South Africa.
Okay, so it's a normal day then. All right, so we'll be chatting and hearing from Nick as well. In many respects, he does what we're trying to do here in South Africa, maybe lessons learned from the United Kingdom that we could import here in South Africa. But maybe let's start with you, Minister, what your opening thoughts are. There may be some people also that weren't here this morning and didn't see what you said. And so if you could just perhaps start in summary, just share what, in the main, what your message was and your thoughts that we should ponder on as we have this discussion.
Yes, thank you, Pete, and it's good to see you again. And good afternoon to all the panelists and the audience. This is a big task, but you know, as government, as the convener, to execute this task, our role has mostly been in the beginning to bring all the stakeholders together for consultation, because we want it to be a very inclusive process. So up till now, we have been bringing together, we had consultations with government departments, public entities, including Transnet, Eskom, Sanral, PRASA, TCTA, IDC, Development Bank, Airports Company, the CESA, Municipal Infrastructure Agency. And then, of course, in the private sector, too, we had consulted with the private sector, including also universities. The University of Stellenbosch, the University of Pretoria, the World Bank next to me, and NEPAD, First Rand Bank, Standard Bank, Council African Maritime Economists. And we had prepared a draft, and we took the draft in consultation to all of these organizations and say, look, this is just a draft. Make your input. Let us benefit from your experience and what you can contribute towards it. We did say to them that we are living in a changing world, and one of the key purposes for government to produce an infrastructure plan up to 2050 is that we need to, first of all, we need to bring investor confidence. But we also need to show as a country that we know what we are doing and we know where we are taking the country in terms of infrastructure. So there's the backlog of infrastructure, there's a need for new infrastructure, and also there's a need to maintain and repair existing infrastructure. So after all of them have made their input in the initial phases of consultation, we then took the draft to Cabinet in July, I think. Cabinet sent us back, they sent us packing. They said, go back and begin to illustrate that in a 50-year plan, you must at least illustrate what you are capable and able to do in the first 3 years of this plan. So we had to go back and we had to work into our plan the 3 years, what we can implement in the next 3 years. And then thereafter, it went out for public consultation. It has been gazetted and it closed at the 30th of September, which is just a week or so ago. So Peter, we are busy collating all the responses. We will categorize them and then we will set up, we have got a reference group consisting of the private sector, the public sector, the academia, and the reference group will then also look at all of these public submissions that we've received and see how we can work some of those ideas into the draft. And then after that, our last cabinet meeting is on the 13th of December. I then have to take that draft back to cabinet by the 13th of December for a last bite at the cherry. But in the meantime, we're also taking the draft plan that we have now, and we have to align it to the spatial development framework. Any country must have a spatial development framework so that you know what you want to build where and what land is suitable to be used for what. So the spatial development framework has also gone through a long public consultation process, and it's also at its final draft. So you bring the National Infrastructure Plan 2050, you overlay the spatial development framework over that, because we come from a very divided past. If you take, for instance, our cities, our towns, you know, apartheid spatial planning is still very visible. So with the spatial development framework will guide us how to integrate cities and towns and how do we bring especially poor people closer to opportunities. Poor people spend at least 40% of their income just on transport costs to get to and from work. So all of that work is happening at the same time. SIDSSA, Infrastructure South Africa, is also playing a key role. They do the coordination of the plan. So I really look forward, Peter, today to hear from the experts in the room. Answer that question. Do you think we are going in the right direction? If not, you know, what are we doing? What can we do? We're open for constructive criticism is very good for any process. And I see today's forum here that we will hear that constructive criticism and we will listen to you and we will improve on the plan all the time. So thank you, Peter.
Minister, thank you very, very much indeed for taking us through the journey that you're on, and also looking forward to the inputs that we can get from our audience here. Let me turn to you. Let me go to Dr. Miriam Altman, because planning is something that you know well, having sat as well as Commissioner in the National Planning Commission in the presidency, and also co-authoring this NIP. So take us through your process, and also, as you're writing, you're probably thinking, there's things I've gone through. This is like deja vu. I've seen this before. And what lessons have you learned that you've been able to write into this one?
Yeah, so thanks.
Yeah.
True, and the minister has just explained what gives me sleepless nights right now, going through all the submissions. This plan is designed to address the concern that we're not making the kind of progress we want to make. So there's a lot of attention to strengthening the institution that's meant to deliver. So it focuses not only on the actual projects, the amounts, and the specifics of that, but it focuses a lot on the institutions that need to deliver, because that's actually where our problem is. It's not on the detail; it's on who and what, who's gonna do it, and how. It's not so much just what. And so there are some design principles, and the first thing is that there's a backdrop to this, which is that. We have to do two things simultaneously. We need infrastructure, as you so rightly said, as any developing country does, even a developed one, but especially a developing country. It's an obvious point that you're building new institutions, new capabilities, and so on. So infrastructure is key, and it's one of the most important things that the state does for its citizens. But there's another transition that we have to make now as well, and I've worked I was chief of strategy at Telecom for that turnaround. And telecommunications is a good example of an industry where it used to get delivered as the telephone company with one single technology, and so it was okay to have a state utility doing it. And the transition we went through at Telecom was to finish that process of making it not a utility mindset, to fully understand that it was in a competitive market. Now, that is now true of these other three sectors that we look at in the NEP. So in this version of the NEP, there'll be another one focusing on municipal services, but this one focuses on big bulk infrastructure around energy, freight transport. We'll look at commuter transport in the next one, telecommunications and water, and the bulk aspects of that. And we will get to the other parts. Now, the problem here is that particularly if you look at, say, energy and freight transport, the technology is changing just as rapidly as telecommunications is now changing. That means the utility model doesn't serve. When you had one technology, one service, one animal, it wasn't changing that fast, the utility model's okay. But when you've got rapidly changing technology, you don't know exactly where it's going, there's all kinds of new models, new ways of financing infrastructure and innovation in that regard, that utility model can't work. It's just not human that a single entity will be open to that kind of change. You need markets, you need competition, you need more effective regulation, and a much stronger state, actually, in that regard, a much more mature and sophisticated capability. So we have to go, as South Africa, we're still making that transition. We may have made it in telecommunications almost, but we have not yet made it in these. And it's a painful process. There are a lot of stakeholders that are affected. There's definitely winners and losers and people who dig their heels in. It's just natural, but we have to go through this process. The NIP is very focused on the character of that transition and driving it step by step. Now, if I can just say, not to take too much time, there are a couple of elements within the NIP that I wanted to lift up, which people may not, when they're reading it, people often focus on the what. How much energy will be procured? How will it be procured? That type of thing. Which dams will be built? The most important thing in this plan is where it points to the rebuilding of human and professional capacity in the state. There is nothing currently in South Africa that is more important than we used to have this capacity, and so much of it was lost over the past decade. And when I say capacity, I mean the basics of, well, firstly, top leadership, but also when we say planning, actually, we're not necessarily that good at planning and bringing to project preparation, finance, and getting it out the door. That's good planning. Planning isn't just dreaming some idea up and writing it on a page. Good planning means that you've got a good idea, you know, and you can take it through to fruition. That's a good plan. That's not something that we're very good at. We could be. It's definitely, it's not rocket science. It's something that is known how to do, but we struggle to get there. So, and that's partly because you can't always buy in these services in the state. You need some minimum capacity, technical engineering, project preparation. It can't always be bought in. It can be done through partnerships, but the state has to have, you have to have some reception. The industry calls it, you know, a better client, the state being a better client. You need some point person who knows what they're doing, who has a facility, because these projects are enormous, they're constantly changing, they're complex, they run over many years. You need that maturity and capability. So that is a big focus of this NIP. Also professionalizing and making more strategic the procurement function. Now when people say, what are you going to do about fraud and corruption, that actually, just those two things would make a very big difference. That's what we did at Telcom, actually. We came into a company with a lot of fraud, and we lifted up the procurement function in from out of the shadows at that junior level where you hide and do whatever your boss wants you to do. And we lifted it up to an exco function and brought in somebody who was a top specialist in strategic sourcing, who made it into one of the most strategic functions in the company. It was no longer administrative, and it wasn't hidden. That is one. So we were dealing with fraud, but we didn't always talk about it. We dealt with it, but we fixed the institution to make it harder to do that. So these kinds of recommendations may feel like sideshow admin type of boring things, but actually they're much more important than the identification of projects at this point. So that's the kind of thing. The only one thing I just wanted to add was, there are many recommendations, but one of the others that probably gets lost in the reading is that SIDSSA would be tasked with establishing an open and transparent reporting and monitoring function. It's sort of at the end of the plan, and I'm sure a lot of people, by the time they get there, they're exhausted, don't even notice it. It's one of the most important recommendations, actually, because that's how delivery happens, is when you have stronger systems of accountability. It enables pushing of performance within the state, and it also enables civil society to drive that performance and require it. It's when you don't share information that you have bad performance. So that recommendation also is actually one of the most important in the full plan, even though, again, it may feel administrative and boring and not very interesting, it probably is the most game-changing.
All right, Dr. Altman, thank you so much indeed. I think let's go to the United Kingdom and say hi once again to Nick Smallwood, CEO, Infrastructure and Projects Authority. And a lot of our journey, Nick, that we are on, you have already done. And I just wonder if you could share, your opening thoughts and also maybe lessons learned so that we don't have to, fall off the bicycle 10 times. We can learn from your challenges over time.
Sure, of course. And I think it's really commendable to see that you've actually invested in SIDS. I think that's certainly the right way to go. It's vitally important to have an infrastructure strategy and increasing levels of detail in your planning as you get closer to a time now. And for sure, it's a complex space. Some of these projects are some of the most difficult and challenging on the planet. And our experience is that you increasingly need to focus on outcomes. What is the outcome you're looking for the citizen, rather than indeed just a list of projects? And you've got added challenges appearing like net zero, and I would encourage a strong focus on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, because they increasingly put an appropriate lens on how you'll have to deliver these programs. But I think just looking at lessons learned from our perspective, I think there's a real need to have a strong body with oversight and project delivery capability to track and monitor and drive the overarching delivery of the strategy. The IPA does that in the United Kingdom, and you have the ISA. And it's really important that I think you invest in the areas that we've highlighted. And those are what I've called the 3 Ps: people, principles, and performance. You need to invest in people to get the skills necessary to develop and deliver complex transformation programs, complex large infrastructure projects. They need to be really skilled in leading teams and integrating the business case, and we use the 5-case business model. And I think having those skills is absolutely the number one priority. People deliver projects. And then we reflect on what I've called the principles. You have to get the basics correct on every single project. There's no excuse for not planning. You have to have robust cost estimates. You have to work with competent players in the supply chain, and that needs some understanding as a client of what that's going to take. And last but by no means least, a focus on outcomes and performance. So tracking and having a real interest in how you're delivering and what you can learn from the current delivery status is really, really important. And we track that as a matter of course now in the United Kingdom. And if you're doing all that, it will drive you to have direct and early engagement with the private sector, those who can deliver the projects, but also those who can invest with you in getting better design solutions, innovative funding models for delivering some of the challenges that you have. And I think we've learnt somewhat the hard way that, you know, there are solutions out there in the private sector. You don't have to reinvent everything in government. And I think going to the people side, we've got a world-class major projects leadership academy in the United Kingdom where we train all the top leaders of our top 200 projects, and they eventually graduate. It's a robust program. I would liken it to a master's level degree course. And we really, really focus on them having the necessary skills to integrate as being key to success. And we're finding that there's a direct correlation between having those people competent and capable and better outcomes. Back to you. Thank you.
Nick, thank you very, very much indeed. And we'll certainly get more comments from you with the wealth of experience and knowledge that you have from the UK experience. Let's come back to the region, Southern Africa, and get a World Bank view, because Ms. Marie-Francoise, Marie-Nelly, you see a lot of these projects coming your way, and some work, some don't. Some plans come your way, and you can already see some of the ones that, you know, we've done this before, this one's not going to work, this one's going to work. From the region and what you've seen, what are your thoughts about the journey that we're trying to go with this NIP?
Hello? Hello? You
Yeah.
hear me? So, Peter, thank you first for inviting me for that. And I've been here since this morning. It was quite fascinating to hear Minister, the President articulate, you know, the vision. And I would like to start by saying that we at the World Bank, we really welcome this approach of positioning infrastructure as a key element for economic growth, but also for improving the lives of the people. And secondly, as Miriam said, the fact that we have anchored that into the national development plans sets clearly the right vision and the principle to articulate these plans. Now, a few thoughts, indeed, that based on our experience in the region, but much more broadly as well. The first one is as you develop this plan, and it's good that, Minister, you said that you have communications with the various players. I didn't hear you mention the end users, because sometimes when you build this infrastructure, sometimes we lose sight of what we are trying to achieve. And sometimes, and very often, infrastructure planners tend to be over-optimistic. And then you have larger infrastructure, you have stranded assets that are not being used. I mean, I've visited the continent and I've seen a number of airports like that, just as an example. The second one, in my view, that is critical is the integration. Because we've seen a number of countries going through sectoral plan, you know, a very nice master plan, a road master plan, an energy generation plan, transmission plan. But really the key point is that how do you ensure that these assets are integrated? So if I take an example, and we saw that the government has recently adopted a very important legislation to facilitate self-generation, embedded generation. How do you ensure that the transmission links will be there to ensure that this production is not stranded in part of the country? So the interface with the utilities that is managing the grid will be an important one. If we go to transport, I think that Miriam mentioned that you are focusing on freight transport. We know that road and rail are competing very often for the same traffic. So how do you organize that so that you don't have repetition in the investment, but you have complementarity? So I think that probably something to take into account. Let me add another couple of thoughts. I think that the presentation this morning on projecting the world in 2030, reminding us that when you build today, we build for 30 years. So how do you integrate the future in the planning of today? And we see that there are a lot of technical changes that are taking place. And in fact, now transport is electrifying. So you do transport, you need the electricity. Now both transport and electricity are using the grid, the data, the digitalization. We see now that most of the network are managed like that, and you can use actually, even in the example of scanty generation that I was mentioning, using the capacity of blockchain of data to capture this energy and make sure that it is not lost. I mean, just to give some example. And finally, very important, I think that the institution has been mentioned, but one element that caught my attention in the document and this morning is that the government has the ambition of having 30% investment to GDP ratio. We are today at 15%, and the public part is 5%. So I think that there is a consensus that the private sector needs to come in a much more significant manner.
Yes.
Now, the key question is that how do you make that work? I think that we had a conversation actually last week with the Minister of Finance and talking of this famous Regulation 16 that defines, the PPP, that is too complex, that requires to be much more simplified, particularly for small projects. Secondly, how do you promote, Minister, the spirit of PPP? Because as Miriam said, you had a tradition when you have utilities in charge, and having them let go, and this is something, Peter, that I have observed, not just in the sub-region, but in the continent, is very difficult to have the contracting agency let it go, to say this can be done by the private sector. So I think that a key principle could be what we at the bank, we call maximizing finance for development, meaning what can be financed by the private sector, let it be done by the private sector. And then you have the government basically preparing, the enable framework, ensuring, of course, that the risks are well distributed between the public and the private sector. And I think that this is where, Minister, I think that putting a lot of effort could certainly have, the ambition of accelerating the number of PPP that could be developed and rolled out in the coming weeks on the institution, within the capacity of the Ministry of Finance to have the proper PPP regulator that will help look at the distribution of risk, the allocation of risk, the tariff structure. And I think that with that, South Africa could be on a good track.
Thank you very, very much indeed for your thoughts and giving us a regional perspective, global perspective as well, and some of the things that you've seen over time. Sugen, you are in many ways representative of the supply chain, suppliers as consulting engineers, and if this plan works, your sector could grow in leaps and bounds. So share your thoughts with us in terms of what the plan promises and what you fear might hold it back.
Yeah, Peter, thank you, and good afternoon to one and all once again. As you've noted, I represent an organization called Consulting Engineers South Africa. So there's all the consulting engineering firms, or the majority of them in the country. And from that point of view, we are obviously very interested in the implementation of this plan. And firstly, it's a plan that we wholeheartedly support. I think that we have a number of these plans, but I think we are slowly getting to a point where we can see how these plans are going to take effect and we are going to start implementing them. And firstly, one of the things that we've been encouraging within our membership very recently over the last year or two is we all understand that these plans have been formulated in a way that they're going to address some of the larger social issues in the country. And the three key ones are unemployment, poverty, underdevelopment, inequality. So 3 or 4 of them. And what we're challenging our membership to do now is, in all of the projects that we implement, how do we make these things a reality? How do we contribute through those projects? How do we consciously engineer our projects so that they become vehicles for poverty alleviation, for job creation? And again, there's policy, there's regulations, there's a lot of how-to documents on how these things need to be done. But they seem to have fallen into the background recently, and we need to bring those to the fore. So that's just in general, and I think this plan is going to go a long way now to bringing those things back to the fore, so that we start consciously addressing these issues. One of the key challenges that we see, can I say, sitting from the outside, from a private sector perspective, is around the capacity of the state. And the previous speakers have spoken about this. I think there's acknowledgement that there is a lack of certain skills in certain areas in the state, and the people are going to be key if you want to deliver on this program and the plan in general. I think, having said that as well, we must also acknowledge that there are certainly pockets of excellence in various parts of the state, whether it's national, in the SOEs, or in the local government sector. And obviously those pockets of excellence need to be embraced, and they need to be capacitated and supported further so that they can also continue to deliver. So we see that as one of the key challenges, the capacity of the state. And we do have some ideas, Peter, on how we think this can be addressed. I'll leave that to the Q&A session, but we have some ideas, and perhaps we can have a discussion around that later. And these ideas that we're going to put forward are based on short-term, medium-term, and long-term interventions, so that we slowly start developing capacity where it doesn't exist. And then the second key challenge for us is really about supply chain management and procurement. And again, we've heard that the supply chain function cannot be a back office function. It needs to be a strategic function if any of our public sector institutions want to deliver on the mandate that they've been given to deliver on. And having said that, we still need to be respectful of what the Constitution demands in terms of being fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, and cost-effective. So not setting aside all of that, but embracing that in the process. And one of the biggest challenges that we find when it comes to procurement, apart from the capacity challenges, but is the confusion around value for money versus least cost. And most of our institutions are tending towards least cost, ignoring the concept of value for money and what that actually means. And when it comes to infrastructure, procurement, development, rollout, the value for money is by far the most important thing. You're building infrastructure for the next 30, 40, 50 years. How do we get the best value for what we're planning and going into the future? So this idea about least costs now at the expense of everything else needs to be challenged. And I think there needs to be a discussion around what the difference is between value for money and least cost. Let me stop there.
All right,
thanks.
Okay. So you're going to do the presentation a bit later, or?
I've covered.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, you found a way to tell the story. Okay, so Minister, I'm going to come back to you because now you've heard a few things, and some thoughts have been shared, and some themes have come through, and one of the strong ones has been state capacity. And you're working in the state, you've worked at a city level, now national, and so you've seen at different layers what that capacity looks like. How are you going to make sure that the capacity is there to make this plan work?
Yes. Let me first talk about state capacity in general. You hear in all kinds of the departments, not only in infrastructure, lack of capacity. I absolutely hate that word because it's become an excuse for inefficiency and ineffectiveness. The government is very structured, a structured bureaucracy. So the Public Service Act prescribed how a government department must be structured. So you've got your DG, then you've got your Deputy Director Generals, then you've got your directors and your chief directors. So it's designed, every department is designed. Now you tell me, Peter, if you have all the warm bodies in those positions in that department, how can you then claim lack of capacity? So it's not lack of capacity, it is that you've got the wrong people in the wrong positions. That leads to lack of capacity. And I think over the years, the state capacity has been eroded. So coming back to infrastructure, when we were given the mandate in December 2019, first of all, government reconfigured government in 2019. And for the first time, government decided to create an infrastructure department. So the first mandate was to go and set up this complete new infrastructure department. And secondly, the second instruction was that we need to go out to the market to go and look for money, but we need projects that we can take to the market. So go and do an infrastructure investment plan. And then the third instruction then was that our country's fiscus is in a bad space, we don't have the money, you need to go out and get the money also. So where did we start? We started off by, first, I said to the Minister of Public Service and Administration, this one size fits all in government to create all departments the same. You cannot have a Department of Infrastructure being designed the same as a health department or an education department. It's just different. And in there, I said, no, I'm not going to go the normal prescribed route. I went to Cabinet and said, look, we need to form a structure. And I named it Infrastructure South Africa. And design it in a way that it can deliver on the mandate that we've got. And also keep Infrastructure South Africa sort of an arm's length away from government, because too close you also mess it up. So we then set out to create CESA. But we couldn't have done it because right from the beginning, with the change of the reconfiguration of government, we involved the private sector right from the beginning. We at one stage had 50 people seconded to us. And then we then designed Infrastructure South Africa in a way that it can serve as infrastructure. And once we've done that, I then went to find the budget to employ, and we are still busy populating CESA. But at the same time, we had to design an infrastructure plan. And I said, where do we start? We then travel around the country. We visited local, provincial, national government departments, and we said, look, just tell us what you have in your infrastructure pipeline that you want to implement, and state-owned entities. And we collected about 276 projects. I said we need to design a methodology, because if you plan the same way, you get it to the same result. So together with the private sector, we designed a new methodology to evaluate all of these projects. Out of the 276, only 55 survived. The rest was not bankable, no feasibility study. And then, so I'm trying to illustrate to you that the lack of capacity must not be an excuse to do nothing, because you then turn to where you find capacity. And we find capacity in the academic institutions. They came on board, the private sector came on board, and we kept it to a minimum. then the president said, now, okay, you've got the plan, and then we now had to go and find the money, because there's no money in the fiscus. So on the 23rd of June last year, we then went to go and pitch all of these bankable projects, pitch them to the market, and then we were able to raise about 340 billion. And so this one is now the second one for 2021. And we are still struggling to get the necessary skills on board. But what we did, we then went out to the market and we recruited a panel of technical experts that you need in the built environment. So that panel has been recruited. They are there. We use them as and when we need them to help us with anything within the built environment. So that has helped us a lot. And then, of course, the private sector has agreed to extend the secondment of the professionals for another year. And that's how we were able to come where we are today with that partnership with the universities, with the private sector that helped us to produce the plan. But if I may just answer two questions that came through from my sister from the World Bank. She spoke about the end user. And I agree 100% with her. That's why we have created what we call a social facilitation methodology. So before we roll out any infrastructure projects, we go to the community, we inform the community. The community is part of the design, the community is part of, they can see the opportunities, the training opportunities for communities. And that is what we've introduced with Infrastructure South Africa, is to inform the communities upfront. Because before this, Peter, what happened is that you've got a construction mafia, and they will go to a construction project and demand 30%. But the 30% is not really for the communities, for themselves. And we found now that we are involving the communities are able to chase them and say, no, you're not talking on our behalf. That is the one thing. And then, of course, the triple P, I agree with all of you. That methodology, it's too long, it's too painfully slow. By the time you finish your putting the triple P together, the investors have run away with their money. Now, also, National Treasury has been reviewing this triple P legislation for the past 5 years. It's still not done. The same with the new procurement bill. The new procurement bill has also been going for the past 3 years now, and it's not done. In a way, I'm glad it's not completed because we were able to move in and say exclude infrastructure from that procurement process because it's just not the same. So I just wanted to bring those few things in. And in terms of supply chain management, the PFMA is very clear, but it's just sometimes the officials don't implement it. We're supposed to, if you got any tender more than 10 million rand, you're supposed to have an independent due diligence team that work through that whole process of procurement. It's not happening, and that is where the corruption comes in. The built environment is the most corrupt sector in our society, and we are working hard. Just to the gentleman from the UK, South Africa, we have adopted the 5Ks business model. We've adopted the principles. We're working with them. They've trained about 30 of our people on that model. And the reason why we adopted the model is that the same model is being used by all the G20 countries. So I also just wanted to thank him for working with ISA to bring the projects where we are today. Thank you.
Okay. Is there anyone on the panel that wants to add anything in particular? Add a comment, perhaps? Otherwise, I will just pick on you.
I spoke, it's the issue of maintenance. And I think very often when we plan for the construction, but not necessarily the maintenance. And I think that this morning on the plenary panel that was raised by one of the panelists, it's very important to add it, because then what happens is that you have infrastructure that is built, that is not functioning, and then again, it translates into stranded assets. So I would strongly advise that as part of the financing framework, in addition to the actual investment costs, you have a provision to ensure that the recurrent costs are being factored in the budget.
All right, Sugen.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I just also want to agree with what the minister is saying about capacity, and it's really a mismatch of skills. The wrong skills in the wrong places, sometimes no skills in the places that they're supposed to be at. I think one of the things that I'm, let me say, slightly disappointed about the NIP and the initial phase is that local government is not going to be looked at, or there's not enough attention to it. And also no disrespect to the drafting team, but we understand their priorities and why certain things need to be done initially. But I think the local government sector is really where we see a lot of, or very little of the skills that are required. Again, just bearing in mind, as I said earlier, that there are still those pockets of excellence. But I think there are innovative ways that we can look at, that we can use in the short term to supplement this skills gap. One of the big challenges that we as the sitting on the outside, and you would know this, that there's been a significant amount of retrenchments that have been happening in the industry over the last few years, and we've seen in the immediate past that has been increasing. I think we've also seen a fair amount of professionals immigrating, and also this trend of semigration, as they use in the property sector, moving from Gauteng to the coast. But a lot of professionals in the built environment sector moving to other sectors, whether it's finance or because those skills are sought after. So that trend is continuing. And we have this dichotomy where we need those skills in the public sector, and we have a lot of those skills in the private sector, and we're not able to use that. And we need to start looking at the resource base and the resource pool from a country perspective rather than from a public sector perspective or a private sector perspective, and see how best we can use those resources. And there could be short-term interventions. There could be short-term measures that we use to supplement with a view to building these skills and supplementing these skills in the public sector over time.
All right, so that's again, thanks very much indeed. Miriam, he says the municipal, local government, it doesn't look like it that they're included.
Yeah, so I thought I should just clarify what's actually happening, so because it's quite an important point. There was a decision to split the process of developing the National Infrastructure Plan into two. So the first part focuses on the big bulk infrastructure, and the second part will focus on more distributed kinds of infrastructure, commuter transport, municipal services, and that kind of thing. Now, there was a logic behind that. Firstly, if you don't have water, there's nothing to distribute. I mean, it's a fundamental point. And as invisible as, it's like fixing your roof. It doesn't raise the value of your house, but you're in trouble if you don't do it, right? So at a local level, you may not feel a lot about that, but that's the fact. So the first thing was to make sure that the big platform infrastructure areas were addressed. Also, the mode of delivery is different. It's more bigger institutions that are involved. It's a different stakeholder process. And also, I think we're closer to the answers on most of them. And we could do it. And in the interests of delivery, the idea that we agreed on was to not spend too much time planning. In other words, developing the plan. rather short-circuit that process, do it as quickly as possible, get it as good as it can be in a short space of time, and then move into implementation, because that's where it happens. You know, this is all about learning by doing. You can never plan too much. You know, you just need a broad idea of where you're going, and then you've got to do it and see what happens then. So the agreement was to do it as quickly as we could, and break it up, so we take it in steps. If we had included the municipal side, we wouldn't be at a point where we have a threshold, we can check, we can move on, etc. Now, what's going to happen now is the plan is to look at these other areas over the next 6 to 8 months. My thinking is that the stakeholder engagement will be different. I think, you know, as was said before, these kinds of services are much more personal and personally felt. So the kind of stakeholder engagement, even in the design process, I think is going to have to be deeper. It's much more complicated, and there are many outstanding questions, you know, not least, what should commuter transport look like? How are we going to sort out revenue collection at the municipal level? You know, all these kinds of things. I don't think we've got any neat answers around it, and we're going to have to do a lot more design thinking around it. And also, as I was saying, the institutional framework and the stakeholder engagement is far more complicated, I think, than this phase. So it wasn't the issue of de-emphasizing it, just to say it was that we were taking it very seriously and wanted to really give it focused attention.
It is an interesting approach.
Can I just make one point, Peter? The first one is that when it comes to, because of this perceived lack of capacity in some areas, but I will agree in local government there really is serious lack of professionals at local government. And they then have to rely on going into the commercial market for consultants. And they charge government an arm and a leg. And they must stop exploiting government. You know, if you buy this pen in a shop for 2 rand, if government buys it, you pay 20 rand or 30 rand. And there's and that's where we need to come together and see some patriotic suppliers who are not there to milk government. There's a lot of it taking place. On local government is that it's the weakest sphere of government responsible for a very important component of infrastructure, and that is to provide bulk services. And to provide bulk services, they get a grant from national government called the USDG, Urban Settlement Development Grant. They get another grant from government called the Municipal Infrastructure Grant. You know what? The underspent there. I mean, so sometimes it's not a question of not having the money, it's not knowing how to spend the money. So there's a big underspent there on bulk infrastructure by municipalities. We have discovered this now also in working with the private sector, and that some of the private sector projects are being halted because there's no further bulk services available. We've got 2 projects in the city of Nkiwane here, whereby there's just enough bulk to build 15,000 human settlement opportunities. If we get bulk, it can go up to 50,000. And you can have gap housing for all the government employees working in Pretoria. It's a massive project. But the municipality were not able to come to the table with the funding from the USDG grant for these development. And I said, look, it's a major stumbling block. Went to National Treasury, and we illustrated to National Treasury that if you give us the money, because there's this partnership between public and private, then from the public side, we will pay the money for the bulk infrastructure, but let the private sector implement the bulk. And you know what the difference that we picked up? If the private sector implement the bulk, it's far less, at least 2 times less than what a normal government department will pay for that. And so Treasury has now helped us to, with all of those housing projects that are standing still because of bulk, and in the October medium-term budget statement, the Minister of Finance will announce, how from government side we're going to invest at national level in bulk infrastructure. But it's holding up a lot of our projects.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that you've mentioned there I'm curious about. You've worked at local government and you've worked at national. So I understand the logic in, doing it in pieces, but putting on your local government hat and you're hearing what you've heard now, what are you thinking? Because there's almost a silo thinking that I think that we often do in government. So your department is busy going on with this plan, and health is doing something else, and local government is doing something else, and heaven forbid if local government's a different political party, it's even worse.
Yes, there are the political dynamics, but there's also the planning issue. When I was the mayor 7 years, I got an infrastructure budget of 6 billion rand per annum, then divided the budget into 60% for new infrastructure and 40% for repairs and maintenance, because repairs and maintenance is so important. And I've been fighting with National Treasury and said, you must now put a percentage down that municipalities must use for maintenance and repairs in their infrastructure budget. So far, National Treasury has proposed 8% of the infrastructure budget to maintenance. I think it's a pittance. So yes, I am using that experience to engage with municipalities. And then there's the Municipal Infrastructure Agency that help municipalities, but the backlog and also in the major cities because of urbanization, people moving towards the cities. And you know what, the last presentation by the Professor Adendorf, the futuristic guy, I don't know if you were there when he was presenting it, but he is so correct. Cities are the drivers of change. And he said within the next 30 years, 750 cities will control the world. So South Africa, we are busy with 3 smart cities, existing cities that we now turn into like the Lanseria Airport one. Great progress. We're planning to do another expansion of a city in Port St. John's. And then here in Pretoria, there's catalytic projects to build government offices here and get the private sector to come in. But the exciting one for me is that in the 2019 State of the Nation address, the President announced that we will do our first new city in our new democracy. Wow. And that task has been given to me. So it's going to be a city where, away from the apartheid spatial planning, but also a modern city. So where are we now? And I've given my first report to the President that we have put together a reference group of academics, some students from urban planning within universities. We're working with the London School of Economics, and then we will be doing the first framework of this new city. And the framework will be presented to Cabinet in March of 2022. So for me, that is the exciting part, where we're going to start and build a city from scratch. Wow. And when we were listening to Professor Adendorf and what the world is going to look like in 50 years, I'm going to go on a co-op team also to come and help us with the new city.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yep.
Interface in the local government, and I want to give an example of one planning exercise that is being done on Eastern Cape, and we have been asked to support. Essentially, the provincial government asked a team of experts to look at the potential for water, for agriculture. Out of this exercise, it has been identified that about 10,000 hectares could be, distributed to promote emerging farmers. But of course, what is already surfacing is a need to have rural roads to connect, similarly have the water available. And I think that it's really a very good example that will eventually bring the national government, the provincial government, and the local government. We now have a proposal that we will be discussing with National Treasury. So I think that the point that you made on how do you do the interface between the technical departments and the provincial government is really an element. Miriam, when you were saying how to implement the plans, these are the type of integration that are very important.
All right.
Can I just have a water, please?
Yeah. Can we get some water, please? Let's get an international perspective on this same sort of question. And perhaps, I think we have Professor Tandeka Nkiwane, advisor to the CEO, International Affairs, NEPAD. What lessons we can learn from the continent? Because most of the issues that we're grappling with, others have grappled with too. So, Professor Nkiwane, thanks very much for joining us. What are your thoughts, partly in what you've heard so far in this conversation, and what lessons we can learn from other countries on the continent, especially when it comes to using infrastructure as a pillar for growth?
Thanks, Peter, and good afternoon to the Minister and to colleagues. Peter, I thought you actually forgot about me. But no, it's been great having to listen to the conversation, because a lot of what's been said actually speaks to what I was going to say. And I think what hasn't been said, what I can just add to the conversation, and I think that colleagues will recognize, that the first thing that I had a laser focus on in the NIP was the fact that Chapter 4 focuses on the regional agenda, right? Building a regional agenda for infrastructure development. And I think it's important because it speaks to a lot of the issues that colleagues have already raised on the panel. This question of economies of scale, the question of lack of capacity in the country, the question of comparative advantage. And I think the point I wanted to make in this regard is the fact that if you look at the National Infrastructure Plan, and if you look at what we do at NEPAD and what's been done at a higher continental level, at the AU level, you'll see a lot of synergies. And where countries are either unable or constrained to do something at a national level, when you upscale it to the regional level and the continental level, that you'll find you can exploit these comparative advantages. You can exploit these economies of scale. You can exploit situations like the minister described, where you buy a pen for 20 Rand as opposed to 2 Rand, where if you hunt the pack, you can do it at a more sophisticated and a more profitable level. Colleagues will know that at the continental level, we have the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. It's something that at NEPAD that we focus on in terms of our infrastructure output. And I think when we look at the National Infrastructure Plan and liaise this with the higher plan at the continental level, obviously there are lots of synergies. Even the plan does speak to PIDA actually in it, but what it doesn't speak to actually are the revisions of PIDA. So I think, and the Minister mentioned that the plan is being revised. Towards the end of the year, it will be represented. And I think in this interim period, what we can do is make sure that we touch base, make sure that we have the full updated information in terms of now PIDA PAP 2, the second version of the infrastructure program, so that we can make sure that again, both plans and programs speak to one another. I think that at the other level as well, if you look at the National Infrastructure Plan and if you look at the Continental Plan, PIDA PAP 2, there is a lot of overlap, rightfully so. We get a lot of our input from member states and then feed back to member states what we can do at a regional level. In terms of Peter PAP 2, we have 73 projects selected. In terms of the National Infrastructure Plan, we have 55. So that when we put this together, there is a lot of overlap. In terms of Southern Africa, INGA 3 is an overlap. Lesotho Highlands Water Project is an overlap. Our plan speaks to the North-South Corridor. South Africa, of course, chairs the Presidential Infrastructure Champion Initiative, and North-South Corridor is specifically South Africa's mandate within that. And as well, the Bay Bridge one-stop border post issue is again something that is spoken to within the Continental Infrastructure Plan. So that where we have priorities as the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, in terms of sectoral projects, I think that there are a lot of issues where we can maximize the impact. The president spoke about it this morning when he spoke about the integration with Namibia on hydro. That these are areas where we can, again, work together, work cooperatively in order to bring things to fruition at a higher level. The minister also spoke this morning about looking at some of the catalytic aspects of these projects. And what I think I wanted to throw in as well is that in terms of our vision, at a continental level, we look at prioritizing sustainable, inclusive, and world-class infrastructure, as we call it. And I think that this speaks directly to the National Infrastructure Plan. It speaks the same language in terms of what we're looking for, in terms of maximizing the socioeconomic impact on populations. We've spoken about this already in the panel. And the fact that the infrastructure facilities that we build and that we prioritize should complement each other. I think the last point I wanted to make is in terms of, again, in this question of capacity that's been mentioned again by a number of speakers. One of our responsibilities as AUDA NEPAD is that we are responsible in part for resource mobilization. And that it is our mandate, it's our responsibility to assist member states, even with issues like pre-feasibility studies, feasibility studies, etc. So that, again, this is an area where we don't have to feel like we're doing it alone as South Africa or doing it alone as a member state, but we can come together and as I put it earlier, hunt as a pack to have more intelligent solutions to infrastructure development. I think I'll leave it like that. Thank you, Peter, and I'm happy to answer questions or contribute further.
All right, I want to stay with you actually, and then I'm going to go to Nick in London. Regulatory and policy frameworks and environment. That is one of the bugbears on the continent, and I know this is an issue that we need to deal with and we're looking at here in South Africa, but sometimes it's the policies, regulatory environments that are holding us back. And I just wonder what lessons we can learn from the continent about unbottling and getting rid of some of these things that hold us back, particularly in the regulatory environment. Tandeka?
I wouldn't phrase it so much that regulatory frameworks hold us back. I think it's the way we roll out the particular regulatory frameworks that can be problematic. And again, I think that this is an area where if we work together, and it's an area that we specialize in, not just as NEPAD, but of course with the African Union Commission too, which focuses on policy frameworks. That's an area that I think we just have to be smart in working together to unblock the bureaucracy, to unblock the red tape, to come up with frameworks that speak to fast-tracking infrastructure development in an intelligent way. That is environmentally sensitive, absolutely. In terms of the green environment, it's one of our priorities now. And in terms of coming up with frameworks that speak to the green environment in an intelligent manner is something that we are happy to work. And we have actually been working with the Minister's Department and other governmental departments in South Africa on.
All right, Nick, let's come to you in London. What have you learned in terms of getting the right policy frameworks? Is he there? Is he gone? He's gone to watch Manchester United lose again. Oh dear. Okay. All right, let's come back here. Yeah, Miriam?
There's a couple of things that I want to respond to. The first is, you know, when you produce a plan, it's not something that becomes the Bible, you know? The whole point is that you set a benchmark for sure about how things are going to be done. But it doesn't mean that that's it. So when we separate it out, we're just trying to say, look, things aren't going so well. Let's just face it. It's not going well. So let's not plan for 3 years and then work out what we do after. And to Cabinet's point, they held the document back, as the minister said, so that we could say something more granular about the SIPs, the strategic infrastructure projects, how we might want to change those, and also the 3-year plan. Because all that matters actually is what you do now.
Yeah.
A long-term plan tells you you need to redirect, but the only thing that exists is now, not 5 years, 10 years. Eventually it'll come. But all that matters is what you do now and whether you need to course correct and change. So I thought that was I thought it made the document much stronger. It created a lot of stress for me. But I thought the document was much stronger for it. And it says something about where Cabinet's head is, that they required it. They wouldn't put the document out without it. Now, but let's just say...
Maybe I must confess.
Yeah. Oh, was it you?
There's a perception out there that government are just announcing plans and plans and plans, and we don't follow through. And there is a trust deficit too, that the public don't believe us anymore. And they're going to say, oh, another plan for the next 25 years. They don't even have anything that they can show us what they're doing now. So we were trying to deal with that perception, which in a way is sometimes true, that we just plan, because every time government come with a new plan and a plan. So that's where the 3 years came in. Show at least what we're going to do in the next 3 years, and then it can latch on to the other 25 years. But also another strategy that I've adopted with infrastructure is not to make announcements about what we are going to plan to do. Because then you also become a government of announcements, and then you don't follow through. So the strategy now is with the infrastructure investment plan is that I will only go there for oversight, or I will only take the precedent there when already the foundation is there, you've got workers there, they've done the EIAs and whatever they have to do. And this is what we've done with the infrastructure investment plan. And there are several projects where we can now are being able to do at least one project per week, but not to announce it, to go there and take the media there and show that it's working. So that is the reason why Cabinet wanted at least some practical things in the plan.
So the thing I was going to say is, so when you're in a situation like we are, where it's not going so well, and a lot of things are standing, then it's not going at the pace we want. The method being used here is to say, well, let's eat the elephant bite by bite. That's the only way to make progress in an environment like this. So the process was, the idea is to focus on fewer things at one go, because we're not a machinery that's running so well. Do you see what I mean? So yes, it may be imperfect, but the idea was, let's get some movement, and we got some good movement with this. If we had loaded more onto it, we probably wouldn't have. So let's get through this. Next step, the local distributed, much more complex set of issues. When that gets done, I may stand on correction, but I would imagine that that's then going to get integrated to then finally release the full thing, which does come together, so that you do have an articulation between the two. So what I'm saying is, it's not something like it's written in stone, it's now the Bible, it's handed down from the heavens. You know, there are people behind it, and the same people. It's not like you've got a plan there and a plan there. You've got the same people doing all of it. So it will ultimately, we're going to see where the synergies are. But, you know, let's take it step by step so that we start making some progress is the thing. That's the idea. Now, the other thing I wanted to say, and I was so happy to hear about the words from NEPAD, is we make a very big deal about the region in this plan. Now, the president, one of the challenges, and it speaks to the integration of plans as well, this plan is written in such a way now that once approved, it can cascade immediately into government's medium-term strategic framework, which is the most important planning document of Cabinet. It then goes into the annual performance plans that should be translated into the 5-year plans, and they will then have to show how the integrated resource plan and whatever now aligns to this approach. It's written in a way that you don't have to be creative. You just pick it up and put it in. Okay? It's a plug and play, basically. Yeah. It's designed specifically like that. So it cascades down from work we did in the National Planning Commission into a cabinet process now, into the medium-term strategic framework, and then downwards. So you're starting to get a planning function, at least in this space, that is working as it should. Do you see what I mean? That's the idea. Yeah. So now let's come to the region. You may have the president sitting on that body. DBSA is definitely working on the north-south corridor. But the medium-term strategic framework doesn't refer to a single transport infrastructure project, logistics project. It refers to the borders, but it doesn't, the upgrading of border posts, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't refer to ports upgrading, how manufactured goods will be transported, and you know that sub-Saharan Africa is the hardest place to get goods across border, and yet Africa, the region, is the most important market for our manufactured goods, so this is a binding constraint. So we heard about Inga and Lesotho, but there's also a very big a storyline around manufactured goods coming across border one way or the other, and like I say, this region is the hardest place in the world, unbelievably, to get goods across. Yeah. So, and we don't have a project plan. So Transnet's interested, they worked with us closely to do this, but there isn't a plan that's sitting in the medium-term strategic framework that says, okay, this is what's going to happen. So what needs to happen in the first place is that those projects have to get shaped in such a way, so that's what we're recommending basically, and the freight, the logistics elements of it have to be lifted up dramatically if we want to see jobs created in the region.
But also the Africa Free Trade Agreement, all African countries will have to begin to lift all of those restrictions so that goods and people can move freely in the region. It's very restrictive, high cost tax at the borders that companies must pay. So I hope that the Africa Free Trade Agreement can start sorting out those problems.
Do you want to comment a bit more on the regulations, because that was something that's come up, that it should be easier to come in and do these projects?
It should be, I agree with you, and the red tape and the bureaucracy. I mean, just the procurement process can take anything between 3, 6, 9 months. And we are working on that regulatory framework and what the president called the ease of doing business. And he's given us clear instructions what reforms must be removed by when. And he's put together a unit in the presidency called Vulindlela, and they are now working on all of those urgent reforms. The one where they have made great progress is on water licenses. Before, you could wait up to 3-4 years for a water license. Today, we've cut it down to 9 months, and he instructed to cut it even further down to 3 months. So we are not doing good in terms of the World Bank report and ease of doing business. There are many other African countries before us. And it's of our own doing. And we have to improve on the measurements of the World Bank so that we can become more competitive. I think we are number 84 in the world on competitiveness and ease of doing business. But at least attention has been given to it. We are now reviewing the Infrastructure Development Act so that we can, you hear this new way of the hydrogen and how we can commercialize and all of that. But there's not a legislative framework that can give effect to what we are, some of the things that we are discussing now. And so we are in the process of reviewing the Infrastructure Development Act. It will be easier to amend it to go and do something new. And I've asked all the, people in the private sector, our state-owned entities, and there are many of the state-owned entities in the built environment. We've got the CIDB, we've got the Council for the Built Environment. There are a number of entities. I think we've got too many entities to help us to sort of make the infrastructure legislation more friendly.
Yep. And then, Sugen, I want you to comment as well, the challenges that you are facing as builders, engineers, particularly some of your international representations. But
I was just going to add a couple of points on your point on the regulatory and the policy side. I think that the Minister and Miriam have clarified in terms of eliminating the red tape, but I think what is also important is really visibility for particularly the private investors to understand what is a new framework. You indicated that before, most of the services were provided by state-owned enterprises. So when the investor comes, he wants to have clear visibility. So let's say now I understand that in the port sector you are considering allowing the private sector to come into the management of this terminal. They will want to understand what is the vision. Will support be public-private? What will be the role of the state? So it's really this type of clarity. Same thing in the energy sector. The private sector is coming, but in that context, what is the future of ESCOM? Will they be involved in the various segments? In terms of the pricing sector, private sector is coming to make money. What is, the tariff structure? Is it cost-reflective? So these are also some elements that needs to be clarified, and I believe that the NIP 50 has already tried to articulate that a little bit better, but I think beyond the red tape and the processes, the vision for its sector and its interface with the other sectors, the related sectors.
All right, okay. Sugen, are you having conversations with government about what can make things easier for you?
We certainly try, Peter. It's not always easy, but we certainly try. I just want to make one or two points before I get to your specific question. I think it's absolutely critical that we have a plan that we start implementing. We've started already, but we need to give momentum to that and implement what we have. A lot of our plans, there's nothing wrong with them. There might be a few shortcomings here and there, but in general, they are good plans, and we need to start implementing those plans. I think as we start moving more and more into this space, one of the critical things for us, again, I say it's sitting on the outside, is all of these state institutions and departments need to make a decision. It doesn't have to be a hard and fast decision, but they need to make a decision about what their core capabilities and functions are going to be. And by that I mean are we as an institution going to be very good at planning and leave the implementation to the private sector to do? Obviously, we will still have oversight over that. Or do we want to get more involved in the implementation downstream of those projects? So I think a lot of our state institutions will need to look at that carefully. Again, I say it's not going to have to be a hard and fast rule, but in general, as a principal point of view, are we going to look after the planning and then maybe let the rest, the private sector, get involved in? And also, it's critical then that we do have professionals on both sides of the line. And it's critical that we have professionals in all of the different fields sitting within the public sector that can engage meaningfully with the private sector when these projects come up. And as the Minister says, to understand firstly, what are we procuring from the private sector, and are we getting value for what we're spending on the private sector? And then the government doesn't get ripped off in the process. Because if you don't have that, once there's that mismatch, that's where you find that government departments do get ripped off. The corruption stuff and all of that, we understand that's all in there, and it obviously needs to be addressed. But what I'm saying from a principal point of view, if you have those professionals on both sides, then you can have those meaningful conversations. I think from a regulatory perspective, what seems to hurt us the most is around procurement. I think there's misunderstanding when it comes to what the regulations say. there's different interpretations within the different state institutions and departments about what certain things mean. And when we try to share these things, one department would say, no, we can't do that because the Auditor General is going to come down hard on us. If you speak to another department, they're doing those things already. So there's a lot of misalignment, misunderstanding, and obviously that creates uncertainty for us trying to engage with the state.
All right. Are there any questions from the floor, by the way, before I forget? So the fastest hand in the west is at the back there, and then the lady to the right. So let's start at the back, because your hand went up really quick. All right, and if you could just say who you are, and then share your thoughts. So put your hand up so they can get a microphone to you. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think this is also made for television on YouTube, so they probably need to hear you. Yeah. And then I'm going to ask Minister, I'm going to warn her about the stadium in the Eastern Cape.
It's not mine.
15, 20 million rand. I want some thoughts on that one. Okay.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for all that you've said and shared, Minister, and the panel. My name is Bernadette Kumalo from KZN. So it's more of a comment than anything, because I come from the private sector. And the Minister already mentioned that in terms of PPPs, it takes forever to get them done and finalized. But what I've found is when I'm wearing my original SAPOA hat as the chair, is a lot of property developers are willing to actually put their own infrastructure in their development, especially greenfields, because they don't want to lose the investment. I'll make an example of our very own development, which is 152 hectares of industrial land, which is also a catalytic project. So we didn't want to lose the investors, so we did put that infrastructure in, which was designed and put according to the municipal designs, and which was actually cheaper, because had we waited, we would have lost all of our investors. So my thing though is, I think the government departments, even though there's a lot of pockets of excellence, however, they work in silos. Because when we put that infrastructure in, even though it was, we went to the bank and we were able to fund it for the whole 152 hectares, we were under the impression that we would be able then to go to the DTI and apply for infrastructure grants, so that at least we get 30% of that infrastructure back, because we're putting it back to the government anyway for their use. And we've created a 7 billion rate space where they had none, and also more than 10,000 employees in an environment where there was no employment at all. However, when you go back to that, then the DTI then says you cannot apply for that retrospectively. So what I'm maybe trying to say is, while all these plans are being made, I think maybe all the departments, including the private sector, should be involved, so that we make sure that any regulation that applies elsewhere are aligned, because in as much as developers want to put the infrastructure in, but they would want the grant back. So that's what I wanted to say. And also in terms of silos, we mentioned logistics, that there's nothing happening. However, in KZN alone, there's been a lot of discussions around Transnet, private sector, in terms of the air, cargo, and road, and also on how to help with the port decongestion. And there were proposals that have been submitted. So there's a lot of work being done, both by the government and the private sector, but it just seems like there is, I don't know, there's a divide somewhere where there's no communication between one another, because I rightfully do say there's pockets of excellence, and it's not about the skill, but I think it's about the number of months it takes for any tenders to be awarded, and I think we just need to try and work on that. Thank you.
All right, so I think this something keeps coming up though, isn't it? Silos and coordination, and we've got this incredible future ahead of us. And I don't know if the Department of Higher Education is already planning for it in terms of the skills that are going to be required to build the infrastructure that you're planning for, because we're going to need engineers. We're going to need all of these people.
Yes. Now, I definitely agree with you that there's a mismatch between the skills that's needed in the economy and what we are producing. And the Minister of Higher Education, Dr. Bladen Zamande, is now being tasked to plot so that we can begin to direct the kind of skills that will be needed in the economy 5 years, 10 years from now, because it is not happening. And also, all the investment that government make into student funding, most of that is not in areas, goes into areas that is not really needed in the economy. So there is some work being done on that. The one way that government has been structured now to deal with the silos is that there are various interministerial committees where we are being sort of forced together. Like I serve on the Interministerial Committee on Land Reform, chaired by the Deputy President. And so human settlements is there, justice is there, rural development, we're all there, and we all account, and we all know what everybody is doing. But there we are guided by the recommendations of the Presidential Advisory Panel on Land Reform. And government adopted 85% of the recommendations, and now it's just implementation, and then, of course, the monitoring of the implementation, which is always very slow. Like many people are making a reference to the supply chain management process. Currently, there's a Supreme Court of Appeal case where they have ruled that the preferential procurement regulations of 2017 is unconstitutional because what is in the regulations is not in the Act, and government has now taken that to the Constitutional Court for final adjudication on the matter. But supply chain regulations, it's so true. Many people interpret it differently. And there was a comment earlier on, I think it's from the UK guy who said that when they have these projects, they train all the management that are working on that particular project. And for me, that is critical, so you have everybody on the same page. But then the stadium, every time when I see it on TV, I just have to laugh. I can only say, Peter, that is a classical illustration of how things should not be done. Yeah. And I can be rest assured that the community was not consulted. Because the community was going to say, no, we don't need a stadium now. We need a clinic, or we need that and that. Yeah. So it's not a very good example for us. Thank you.
Okay, last question there, because we're going to have to start wrapping up. If you could, have you got a microphone? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Good afternoon, Minister. Good afternoon to the panel members online as well. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My question is to the gentleman from CESA. One of the comments you made was how supply chain management and procurement is a big challenge, and you challenged us to move towards value for money as opposed to least cost. Now, the way I thought about it was, if I'm going to buy training shoes, I want to pick the expensive ones that are going to last me for longer, but also that are going to help me with stability if I'm running. But how would you do something like that in a complex project where you're going to get this value for money interpreted perhaps differently by different bidders? And I wanted to know whether there are countries that are already using value for money and not least cost. How do we make sure that we still remove subjectivity in the procurement process when we are saying we want value for money as opposed to least cost? Thanks.
All right, before you answer that, we have to start wrapping up. So each one of you a minute each maximum, sort of your golden nuggets that we'll leave people with. And remember, we've also got an audience that are watching us online. So Sugen, answer the question and also start wrapping up as we say our final words.
So yeah, thank you for the question. So the first thing is, and I said this before, is that the prescripts of the Constitution must be respected whenever we do any procurement. Fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, and cost-effective. So that's where the value for money proposition comes in. So, and this concept internationally is currently called quality cost-based selection. So it factors in quality and cost into the procurement process. And when we speak, I'm going to speak about value for money only in terms of professional services for now. If we have time, we can go into more, but just for now in terms of professional services. So what currently happens is that, let's say there's a request for proposal to develop a wastewater treatment works, a sewage treatment works. It will go out to the market, and bidders are required to put a price to that. And let's say that all of the scope of the project was fairly well defined and what the end product was going to be. What typically happens is that the bidder with the lowest price, now for the professional services, the engineering services, the bidder with the lowest price, cost would be awarded that project. Very often that bid or the adjudication of that bid doesn't take into account whether that bidder has past experience, whether the professionals that he has on his team has the necessary experience, that they have done this work in the past. And very importantly is when you base professional services on the lowest cost, you're removing the opportunity to innovate in that project. Because it's the award is focused on the price, bidders don't have the opportunity to build in innovation, looking at alternative methods of construction, all of those nice things into their bids, because the price for that is obviously going to be more. And also what's very critical with infrastructure development is, if you look at that wastewater treatment works, that client or municipality is going to operate and maintain that works for another 20 or 30 years. So many of the choices that are being made in the initial procurement and the design phase is going to affect how that piece of infrastructure, how that wastewater treatment works is going to function over the next 20 or 30 years. And also what the life cycle cost of that piece of infrastructure is going to be. So the decisions that you're making at the design stage are going to influence that. And typically, if one looks at it, the cost of the design versus the life cycle cost of that piece of infrastructure is typically in the order of 1 or 2% of the life cycle cost of that piece of infrastructure. The construction cost is the professional services cost in terms of the construction cost is in the order of 10%. So we're trying to squeeze that cost as much as possible, bearing in mind that it's only 1% of what the life cycle cost is going to be, but the fundamental decisions that you're making there are going to affect how that piece of infrastructure is maintained and operated over the 20 or 30 years. So the value for money concept is, how can we put together the best solution for that piece of infrastructure?
I'm going to have to interject, unfortunately, because we are running out of time, desperately so. So
let me just wrap up.
I think you can have your MBA chat with her just now, but if you could just, your final thoughts, literally just your golden nuggets that you can leave people with before we go.
Yeah, no, so we, just in closing, we wholeheartedly support the National Infrastructure Plan.
Yeah.
We have made our comment. For us, it's critical that we start implementing the plan as best as we can. We have to start implementing. I just wanted to say, when you asked me before about our engagement with government, the minister was at our Ndoro 2 years ago, if the minister remembers, last year actually. So we do have those engagements. And one of the key things that the minister said at the Ndoro was that we must implement. The patience of our people is running low, we must start implementing. And that's really what we want to see. And as the private sector, we want to partner with the state and we want to make this a success.
Okay. Prof. Tandeka and Nkiwane, your final thoughts?
My final thoughts were provoked by Minister de Lille when she talked about the African-Continental Free Trade Area. And I think what is going to be a critical developmental game changer is going to be this question of addressing intra-African trade. And to address intra-African trade, we have to squarely address the question of infrastructure and infrastructure development. If you look at other continents, you look at Europe, they are at about almost 70% of intra-European trade. Asia, almost 60%. The Americas are hovering around 55%. On the African continent, depending on who looks at which stats, we hover between 16 to 24%. And it's something that is going to have to be addressed. The National Infrastructure Plan speaks to this. I'm looking forward to our team and Miriam's team coming together once again to make sure by the end of the year that the plan and some of our continental frameworks speak seamlessly to each other. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Marie-Francoise, Marie-Nelly.
Yes, I also, at the World Bank, welcome this plan that is really embedded in the long-term vision and also in the medium-term expenditure framework. 2 points. The first one, I want to reiterate the importance of the integration of the multimodality of the various types of infrastructure. And second, if you are going to reach your 30% investment ratio to GDP, you need more private sector. I think that this is very clearly articulated in the plan. And for that, the private sector is there. The private sector is ready. Try to simplify, Madam Minister, the procedure, the regulation 16, remove the bottleneck, and you will see South Africa is visible. Private sector is ready to move and to jump in.
Thank you. And I'll give the final word to the Minister. Dr. Miriam Altman, your final thoughts?
Okay, so look, I'm trained as an economist, and that means I love hiding behind numbers and jargon and big words,
and
okay?
saying all things being equal.
Yeah. But you know, when it really comes down to it, this is about people. We think big infrastructure, big energy, even that is about people. That's what this is. And we keep forgetting that, at least in this country. We keep forgetting that at the root and heart of turning this country around is having people in place who can do it. So when we say we've got to strengthen the borders, we've got to have value for money, right? That means you've got to have strategic procurement capability that knows what that means. It just means that the thing can actually do, you know, it should still be affordable, but it should do the thing that it's meant to do. It's that point that was made, that it's focused on the outcomes and not just getting the thing done at least cost, because what's the point? When you have basic junior procurement people doing it, you're going to get a least cost approach because they can't do anything else. They wouldn't know how to get to a value for money approach. They don't have the capacity. It's just an obvious point. But we're not talking enough about this in this country. And as the minister was saying, it's not unique to infrastructure. As a National Planning Commissioner, what we were trying to do is lift this up in a whole range of areas to say, what are the people-oriented leadership issues? Let's speak specifically so that it doesn't feel so abstract. Because that kind of statement sounds very abstract and loose and soft. But actually, it's by far the absolute most important thing is who is going to do it. And we need a national conversation and hammering away at that issue so that becomes the top thing that we speak about in this country, even when we're talking about this big boy stuff around energy and big water and big stuff. that it still comes down to the people that are going to deliver and whether they're enabled to do it in their job. Number one national conversation should be about that, not e-tolls and all kinds of other random stuff. That is the number one question in this country.
Thank you very much indeed. And final word from you, Minister Patricia.
Well, let
Dillon.
me start with the supply chain management. You know what's the most painful for me when it comes to supply chain management? When the Public Finance Management Act says that you must pay a supplier within 30 days. That's the law. And then we don't pay suppliers within 30 days. You see many of the small SMMEs go under because of their cash flow. And I think that's one area where government really need to improve. Because in terms of the Auditor General, that is a finding against you if you don't pay within 30 days. So that government is also busy fixing. You will see with my department, every week I release a statement on Twitter about how many invoices we've paid, how many of them are outstanding. But that is one supply chain management issue that must be addressed. But in terms of what brought us here today, and what is the role and function of government? The role and function of government is to create the environment conducive for the private sector to create jobs. And therefore, government must lead by investing in infrastructure. So with a little bit of money that we have, government is showing that we are leading with investing in infrastructure. But like the Planning Commission has said that we must, by 2030, we must at least invest 30% of GDP into infrastructure. We're currently at 14%. So we've got a long way to go to 2030. But the private sector in South Africa especially, they're only contributing 2%. And this is what we are all about here today, is to say, we expect you also to be patriotic, to work together with government to build this infrastructure plan that's going to create the much needed jobs for our people in our country. And for me, that is the critical departure point, that as government mustn't promise a whole lot of jobs. It's not government's job to create jobs. It is the private sector. Government must create the conditions. And this is what I've learned in the past 2 years in working with the private sector. And also building, there's a big trust deficit between the private sector and government. But you have to work on narrowing that trust deficit, and it's coming down slowly. And I think once we're over that, you'll see a better response from the private sector. But already I'm pleased with the response that we've been able to generate in the past 15 months, and I'm very hopeful. We must never give up hope. Yeah. We must always keep hope alive that things will even improve after the SIDSSA 2021. In terms of the progress, please go to the SIDSSA website. I didn't want to have a long speech this morning by giving you a report back on all the progress, but it is there. You can see out of the 340 billion that we've raised in 2020 on the 23rd of June, already 190 billion has been spent. So some projects are in construction, some in feasibility studies, but the progress is there for everyone to see. And please, we're open for advice. We're not going to claim that we know everything. Dr. Ramagopa and his team, together with the help of the private sector, we're open for advice. You know, people can contact me anytime with any ideas that they have. But I'll also be the first one to admit in humility that there's still a lot more to be done. Yeah. And time is running out. The time of talk is over. We need to walk the talk. We need to show the people of this country that as government, we are a caring government, and we want to see South Africa succeed. COVID-19 has exposed the fault lines in our country. It has just put it into our faces, the inequality, the poverty. And we must see that as an opportunity to improve going forward. So thank you to all of you for coming out. Thank you, Peter, for facilitating this. I've taken a lot of notes, and we will certainly be in touch. Thank you so much, and God bless.
Thank you very, very much indeed. And thank you also for joining us. Final word from me. There's just one thing, I mean, what the Minister was saying, but also what Miriam said that just sort of sat with me in the end. We just got to deal with what we have to do today. It's pretty simple. Yes, the plans are great, and they're living documents. They're not set in cement, but they're there to guide us. So let's focus on what we can do today and just do it. So thank you so much for that. Thank you to our panelists. A final round of applause. And to you, thank you all very much indeed. And we'll see you in the plenary room now. I think we have one final word from Minister Ngugubele. Okay, thank you all very much indeed. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.